Right, so let me just see if I can get my controls to go as well. There we go. So in scholarship, methodologies have been coming and going, but in biblical studies, they tend to stay, or maybe they keep on coming, also at times when they were expected to go. The staying power of some methodologies may exceed, many may argue, their usefulness as reported by biblical scholars and even by Bible users generally. So too, the arrival of methodologies at times have received acclaim, but in the end seem to have overpromised or maybe just underdelivered. Metaphors of traveling and staying are useful for hermeneutical positions and methods in biblical studies, but beyond their usefulness, they also signal those elements that do not always receive adequate attention in biblical hermeneutics. Traveling and staying are, in any case, also valuable images to encapsulate and model scholarly habits in biblical hermeneutics in terms of their spatiality and temporality, and maybe even their temporariness. However, these metaphors' associated agency is more properly located in their practitioners, in us as biblical scholars as well. A general reluctance by biblical scholars to be methodologically accountable, perhaps not so much in execution as in appropriating methodology, as well as to account for socio-political wherewithal of chosen methodologies, exacerbate the dangers of emphasizing methodology rather than scholars' agency. So in my contribution, I want to argue one or two things. That scholarship, biblical scholarship, remains caught up in a methodological melee, with historical criticism still the preferred vehicle of travel. But since scholars and their methods are socially located and methods are scholarly homes that create and define where and how scholars work, informing their identity, some repositioning of methodological considerations is appropriate and in the interest of biblical scholarship in general. Hermeneutical questions in biblical studies come with the territory, since the quest to understand and make sense of the Bible is central in formal and informal, intellectual and ordinary contexts. Biblical interpreters in intellectually driven academic contexts have formulated theoretical positions and constructive interpretive methodologies from earliest times, albeit for different reasons. In short, methodology follows in the wake of hermeneutics. In South Africa and elsewhere, biblical scholars have devoted much energy to method in biblical studies, often to the detriment of investigating the Bible's social role, the contextuality of its interpretation, or theoretical reflection about any of those. Pleading for a re-evaluation of the use and the role of high theory or simply theory, some scholars claim that it has not had so much uptake in biblical studies, and where it was taken up as system and method only. Methodology was the enablement as well as the end result of a relationship with what some call the Enlightenment Bible and the endless specialization and subdivision of biblical studies. Some go so far as saying what defines biblical studies is less that it possesses method than it is obsessed with method, and as such it is possessed by method. Biblical studies' heavy ongoing investment in critical methodologies, we can also call it the methodolomania a la Sandmel, has attracted scrutiny for many reasons, but can also be challenged in particular for the accompanying unacknowledged interests and their promotion. Method is not merely the guide showing the academic way, but conjure up scenarios within which scholarly engagement can or cannot happen. Amidst issues pertaining to power in and of interpretation, unacknowledged interests, together with an insistence on objective, neutral interpretation, amount to what can be called an innocence syndrome, which is dangerous and feigned. It is feigned because, given people's situatedness, that provides the context from where and through which human existence is involved, all human existence are filtered and thus defined. But an innocent stance is also dangerous because it is in itself a highly political agenda, with the peril intensified by attempts to disguise and sublimate it. Putting innocence aside allow for the grounding of biblical interpretation, and decisions about method can then be accounted for in chronologically and socially determined moments. Growing acknowledgement of the socio-political situatedness of methodologies implies accounting for the effect of methodologies in biblical studies by taking scholars and scholarship's social locations into account. Biblical scholarship that takes its social embeddedness serious as a point of departure and as frame of understanding does not discount proper and adequate historical consciousness. It's not the one or the other. A good example of where the historical baby is not thrown out with the historical critical bathwater is, for example, new historicism. In its many guises, it has shown concern for the material conditions of texts and their production, accompanied by an examination of possible omissions, alternative explanations, and incorporation of other relevant material. So while history can and will remain crucial for biblical interpretation, without locking it into a particular methodology, two factors appear to drive the predilection for biblical scholars' methodological engagement and for their quest for a singularity of meaning, but a pluralism of approach. One is biblical scholars' anxiety to shield their work and discourse on the Bible from accusations that it may be subjective or personal, private, pietistic, pastoral, devotional, or homiletical. And the resultant works often then lackluster and predictable nature, which ends up also, that very lackluster, predictable nature ends up as validation of the work's integrity. Another reason for the emphasis on methodology is probably the attempt to muster a major scholarly effort in a desire or the inclination, disinclination to deal with uncomfortable moral questions. And I realize there are various other reasons that one can also cite, but I think those are also important reasons. Amidst the traditional, and many would say historical critical stance and even insistence on its universal and homogenized relevance within the Biblical Studies Guild, a growing variety of hermeneutical positions have emerged of late. But endeavors for an ideologically objective, a morally neutral, and a hermeneutical universal interpretation in biblical studies remains best exemplified under the historical critical umbrella. Notwithstanding increasing reflection on methodology and meta questions about theory and method, and all those involved and affected by it, it seems as if historical criticism continues to reign supreme. Some have even referred to as the totalitarian state of historical criticism. In recent years, scholars have started to point out serious challenges inherent to this approach. In general, 6 underlying principles seem to characterize historical criticism: its strong positivistic foundation and orientation, its claims to neutrality, to objectivity, and universalism, and also its focus on methodological rigor to the neglect of social positions of readers. The emphasis on methodological expertise has had a number of salient weaknesses, including the neglect of literary criticism, limited attention to sociological and anthropological models, and the preponderant concern for the theological content and message of texts. In addition, the call for and especially the negation of partiality of biblical critics have mostly been more apparent than real. So the historical critical model have revealed serious tensions between aim and practice, and notwithstanding its claims, in the end, no univocal or objective meaning was provided. The model was often, and still often is, remarkably naive, with personal and social construction of text presented as scholarly retrievals and reconstructions. And here's the danger with this. In this way, historical criticism became inherently colonialist and imperialist, since the bracketed male Eurocentric or global North identity was unreflectively universalized. In recent years, historical critical method have started to lose some grounds for a number of different reasons. On the other hand, notwithstanding some of this content, some scholars have reinvested in a redefinition, even a reconceptualization of historical criticism in and for biblical studies. Ongoing fragmentation in the biblical studies field that neither offers a challenge to or provides alternatives have even strengthened historical criticism. I have a bit more to say on this, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to stop it with that and simply to say that in the end, what happened with historical criticism is that while initially historical possibility took a backseat to moral possibility in texts, it was more important to prove the in the history of the gospel according to Mark, whether events have really happened, than whether the moral implications, what the nature of the moral implications of that was. So historical concern became, and to this day remain, the means to offset concerns about the Bible's political authority. And that's what it, in the end, turned out to be, that the Bible's theological authority was protected by eliding it into a sort of cultural authority claimed for the Bible. So the resistance against perceived or real challenges to historical criticism not only reflects intellectual epistemologies and positions, but also explicit and implicit ideologies, professional commitments, and long-standing traditions of a guild. Scholarship's myth of origins, tracing its roots back to a certain time and place, determines its goals and means. By naming, describing, classifying, insisting on categories, it creates room for the production of knowledge. Relationships between ourselves and within our guild construct us as scholars in our scholarship, even if we at the same time are socially located in today's postmodern economic and cultural structures, which some may prefer to call neoliberalism. The neoliberal era overlaps and is interlinked with postmodernity and multiculturalism as distinctive historical and cultural trends over the past 40 years. And all three of these play into what some have referred to as the technologies of the self and branding culture, which has come to characterize biblical scholarship. In short, participation and academic location within a discipline situate scholars temporarily and spatially. Although it mostly went unaccounted for in the past, today the impact of scholars situated on their scholarship is increasingly recognized. And that brings me to an important point that I want to make, namely that methods are not simply theoretically informed, systemic, heuristic instruments or procedures with which to approach texts, not simply tools as, say, for example, a carpenter would use to craft a new piece of furniture from raw materials. Conceptualizing hermeneutical methods as only instruments to be employed, of which the output is determined solely by the user's skill and resilient application, ignores a range of other important considerations when it comes to hermeneutical approach and method. Although a method or hermeneutical theory may at times become an intellectual fashion accessory, scholars tend to invest, knowingly or not, much more in theories and methods. Rather than functional tools, or to return to the earlier metaphor, more than maps to travel with, methods are scholarly homes. Methodology involves heuristic devices and processes, but also create and defines the spaces within which scholars work, and this informs their identity. Providing the comfortable and comforting enabling space between social relations and individual behaviors, method serves as home or even habitus. For scholars, method is what mediates between professional, hermeneutical, and interpretive practices situated within the social relations and hierarchies of professional disciplinary orientations. Habitus entails that scholars, as social agents, develop strategies adapted to the needs of their social worlds. But method not only constitutes home, it also identifies home by making it discernible for its inhabitants. Method maps or constructs the route towards home or back home, giving scholars, so to speak, a familiar place to kick off their shoes. As mediating ground between scholarly work and academic structures, between individuals and social relations, method has a vital and a wide-ranging role. It reaches beyond the procedures and techniques to be followed and amounts to more than the roadmap of the academic journey, since it also scripts the language. It brings the territory into being. And of course, at the same time, it fences off, it delimits, it restricts. So holding method as a home does not imply that it primarily is or is restricted to spatiality, whether that's institutional or disciplinary or ideological. Not restricted to location, method as homes, that situatedness or social location informs people from which they construct their identity and social relation. Home forms and informs our sense of who we are, and it creates the space within which our activities and thoughts make sense and are structured and restructured in relationship to our environment. Without such structure, there is no home. Without method, research is impossible. Not so much in the sense of epistemological tools, but because all research depends on methodological presuppositions and approach, whether it's made explicit or not. So scholars' situatedness does not stand aloof from social context or local and global events, but these are all interconnected in various ways. So there's little surprise in noting that major hermeneutical trends developed shows an uncanny resemblance and compatibility to central governing ideological positions of the day. Scholarship, as well as scholars, inevitably are created and formed by particular historical and social contexts, sometimes consciously, other times unwittingly, although it is hardly plain sailing. Various elements, but prominently so, language impact on the construction of scholarly homes. As much as language opens up and allows creative and imaginative, reimaginative thought, the limits of home is demarcated by the constraints of language and restrictions imposed by its conceptual range. However, as much as they need and rely on describing and circumscribing methods, scholars are tripped up by the very effort of putting it into words. So language is the curse of method, as much as it's also the resource that makes our ability to conceptualize methodologically possible. Is the reason why language can become a methodological stumbling block? Maybe its embeddedness in actual social historical contexts. This does not mean that that method is absent when language is lacking, or even when it is not consciously articulated, or when it does not conform to the consensus opinion. If one accepts that methods constitutes scholarly homes, in fact, fill out and define scholarly practice, and in the end inform scholarly identities, what are the implications for the future of Bible and method? As some methods in practice, if not in theory, may come and go, developments in biblical hermeneutics reflect the social locations and tenors of their practicing communities. Scholarly willingness to recognize and account for hermeneutics is more than erudite, as more than erudite taxonomies is growing, and hermeneutics involves and impacts increasingly on us as scholars and our scholarship on personal and structural levels, and even the communities in which we work and live. Acceleration and intensification of the supply and demand of biblical studies methodologies may, and in some instances already have, lead to a general irrelevance or obsolescence of specific forms. Moreover, in the midst of positive developments, biblical hermeneutics has to be wary of a post-liberal, market-driven, tolerant, horses for courses approach, when identity politics approaches that demand priority and privilege, often in direct challenge with one another, is a particular concern. I would want to say a bit more about identity politics, but maybe we can talk about that at a later stage. Apart from that, the danger of identity politics, this does not imply that one should simply dismiss new trends, even trends that may seem faddish, without first engaging possible reasons for their origins, or why scholars advocate for them. We're not restricted to scholarly navel-gazing. Methodology in the broad sense of the word is more than the inconsequential means to accomplish the single all-important end. Scholarly homes are typically not constructed as show houses, but as spaces to be inhabited. They offer circumscribed, carefully constructed, tailor-made abodes, which in turn enable scholarly life while confirming, sanctioning, and validating that life. And that requires openness in biblical interpretation, openness to various social locations, and also to a variety of real readers, not literary constructed readers, but real readers. In addition, the methodological scope and focus of biblical studies have allowed it to set up artificial walls, unfortunately, between academic and lay naive reading, between scholars and the so-called ordinary reader. As a, I'm way behind on my show, sorry for that. As a consequence of methods' homely nature or homeliness, is the assurance and comfort it may be deemed to provide. And my argument is not to eradicate this contentment. Of course, it is important to stay aware of and to take preventative measures against being too comfortable and to be too comforted by such homeliness. But methodological and even scholarly comfort found in hermeneutical approaches and methodologies is not necessarily restrictive or negative, but it does require acknowledgement and analysis. The claim's empirical accuracy aside, the distinction between interpretation and criticism hits the mark when somebody like David Klein says, not one academic biblical scholar in 100 will tell you that their primary task is to critique the Bible. For some reason, we have convinced ourselves that our business is simply to understand, to interpret, end of quote. So, Chair, I then want to conclude with three notions. In the end, the challenge, both in the sense of critique and invitation, is perhaps as simple and as complex as rethinking the very nature of what we do when we do biblical scholarship. For some, from the perspective of theory, for others through imagining and branding, for some in negotiating cultural and political turns following the linguistic turn, or in many other ways. The question is not simply which methods or what approach, or how to distinguish history and theology, or secularity and religion, but why biblical scholarship have such distinctions, and theoretical and epistemological positions and practices in the first place. Why were the scholarly homes built in the particular ways, by whom, and who resides in them for what reasons? Is the realization that all interpretation, like observation, is theory-based and determined, perhaps a much overdue starting point for further deliberation and discussion? In fact, the acknowledgement that no theory, position, or method exists without some assumed or explicit presuppositions, and that all such are embedded in social locations, at once complicates ventures to understand, if not unravel, all the adjoining chords. But it also alerts interpreters that privileged positions and knowledge exist only in theory and become or are made real through general consensus or agreement. And then finally, the notion that a Bible is a resource that challenges people, that it can disrupt conventional thinking about traditional ideas and settled identities, falls back on an established biblical tradition, if not always a scholarly practice. This is not so much to argue for the Bible as destabilizing force, but rather for the Bible as a resource for rethinking conventional or traditional spaces that are zones of safety for especially a male-gendered global north identity producing its clones across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy, so much for this clear